My name is Steve Ross. I was 46 years old when everything I thought I understood about my family finally arranged itself into something honest. This happened 2 years after I lost my job, and exactly 14 days before my wife's birthday. I remember the timing because, until that moment, I still believed time itself might soften things, might bring people back to who they used to be. I had spent most of my adult life assuming loyalty was quiet and unannounced, that if you showed up every day and carried your weight, love stayed intact. That belief didn't shatter loudly. It dissolved while I stood alone in my daughter's bedroom, holding her phone, reading words that were never meant for me. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to the beginning. The discovery itself wasn't dramatic. My youngest daughter had left her phone on her bed while she ran downstairs to grab a charger. It vibrated once, then again. I picked it up without thinking, intending to silence it so it wouldn't distract her. The screen lit up with a Telegram notification preview, and the group name caught my attention immediately. It used my surname, followed by a laughing emoji. That alone would have been enough to pause me. But underneath it was a message preview that read, "Do you think he's cried yet?" There was no anger in me when I opened it. Only a small, clinical curiosity, the same feeling you get when you notice a crack in a wall and lean closer to see how far it goes. The group had been active for 3 years. 1,342 messages. The title they had chosen for me appeared repeatedly, always capitalized, always accompanied by jokes and inside references. The Terrible Man. They talked about my job loss like it was a sporting event, placing bets on how long it would take me to break, whether I would start drinking, whether I would finally realize how pathetic I looked trying to stay optimistic. They joked about my job applications, about the suits I still wore to interviews, about the way I smiled at dinner as if nothing had changed. Reading it didn't hurt the way betrayal is supposed to hurt. It clarified, like finally seeing handwriting you'd misread for years. What stopped me wasn't even the cruelty. It was recognition. My wife's name appeared constantly, not defensively or reluctantly, but comfortably. She wasn't moderating the group. She was feeding it. Her messages were casual, efficient, sometimes affectionate toward others in the chat. And then there was a name I didn't recognize at first, someone who spoke with familiarity, who joked about shared weekends and inside moments that didn't include me. It took several scrolls before the obvious settled in. He wasn't a coworker or a distant relative. He was her boyfriend. The man she planned to introduce publicly, as if I were an outdated appliance being replaced, not a person who had built the life they were now mocking. The most revealing messages weren't the insults. They were the plans. Detailed, coordinated, discussed months in advance. My wife's birthday was circled like a deadline. They talked about seating arrangements, about how they would finally stop pretending, about the look on my face when she stood next to him and thanked everyone for supporting her through such a difficult marriage. One message suggested applause. Another suggested filming it. Someone wrote that humiliation worked best when the target didn't expect resistance. I read every word carefully, not because I needed more evidence, but because I needed to know whether there was any confusion left. There wasn't. As I stood there, I became acutely aware of the room around me. My daughter's posters crooked on the wall, a sock half tucked under her bed, the quiet hum of the house I paid for, furnished, maintained. I thought about the surprise gift I had already purchased for my wife, hidden in the trunk of my car. I thought about the speech I had planned to give at her birthday dinner, where I intended to tell everyone I had accepted a new role, one that would have redefined the last 2 years of whispered pity. I realized, with surprising calm, that none of that belonged to the people in that group anymore. There had been signs before. They made sense now, lined up neatly. Holidays where decisions were made without consulting me. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Jokes that landed just a second too late for me to catch the context. My daughter's avoiding eye contact when money came up. My wife suggesting, repeatedly, that I manage expectations whenever I talked about rebuilding my career. At the time, I told myself this was stress, embarrassment by association, the discomfort of watching someone fall and not knowing how to help. Standing there with the phone, I understood it had been coordination, not confusion. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't react. I took screenshots, slowly, methodically, making sure names and timestamps were visible. I emailed copies to myself and backed them up to a private drive. When I was done, I placed the phone back exactly where it had been, aligned with the edge of the bed. When my daughter returned, I stepped aside so she could reach her charger. She smiled at me, casual and unguarded, and thanked me for waiting. I nodded. Nothing in my face gave me away. That restraint wasn't strategic yet. It was instinctive, like stepping back from something hot once you realize what it is. That evening, I cooked dinner like I always did. I listened more than I spoke. My wife talked about the birthday plans I thought I was helping with. I asked neutral questions. Inside, something irreversible had shifted. Not toward revenge, not toward rage. Toward acceptance. I finally understood that I had not been slowly losing my family. I had already lost them, years earlier, and had simply been allowed to stay in the house out of convenience. That clarity didn't make me smaller. It steadied me. And once I was steady, I stopped wondering whether I deserved better. I started deciding what would happen next. The days after I found the group passed without friction, which told me more than confrontation ever could have. No one sensed a shift because I didn't provide one. I woke up at the same time, made coffee the same way, folded the newspaper I still read out of habit. My wife continued speaking to me as if we were aligned, as if the future was a shared object sitting between us on the table. I responded politely, occasionally affirming plans I already knew would never happen. The absence of anger wasn't discipline. It was distance. Once you see something clearly, you stop reaching toward it instinctively. That was the beginning of control returning to me, quietly, without ceremony. I reread the messages at night when the house was asleep, not obsessively, but selectively. I focused on anything that involved planning, coordination, timing. They had chosen her birthday deliberately, not because it was convenient, but because it guaranteed witnesses. They wanted an audience that couldn't look away without feeling complicit. Friends, extended family, people who still assumed we were intact. The humiliation wasn't meant to be loud. It was meant to be polite, delivered with smiles and glasses raised. That was the most revealing part. This wasn't a moment of weakness or impulse. It was theater, rehearsed and refined over time. What surprised me most was how early they started planning it. Some of the messages dated back over a year. At that point, I was still working, still paying for vacations, still showing up to events with the confidence of someone who believed effort mattered. Even then, they were discussing timelines and optics. My wife joked about how people would finally understand once they saw her next to someone successful again. That word stayed with me. Again, as if my value had already been categorized as temporary, conditional, easily replaced. I stopped reading after that. I didn't need more context. I had the pattern. I had initially planned her birthday carefully. I always did. She liked public gestures framed as spontaneity, so I had arranged a dinner that would feel organic while still being structured. I had contacted vendors, secured reservations, coordinated with friends she trusted. I had also planned to say something that night, something that would reset the narrative the group had been feeding itself for years. The irony wasn't painful. It was instructive. I realized that what I thought was generosity had been interpreted as predictability. They knew I wouldn't disrupt the moment. They were counting on it. That was when preparation replaced reflection. I didn't rush. I didn't improvise. I went back through my emails, contracts, calendars. I confirmed the start date for my new role and the embargo on the announcement. I spoke to my attorney under the pretense of routine updates, listening more than I talked. I reviewed account access, vendor agreements, payment schedules. None of this felt like revenge. It felt like correcting an administrative error. For years, I had been funding a story that portrayed me as irrelevant. I simply stopped underwriting it. At home, the atmosphere remained unchanged. My wife asked if I wanted to invite more people to the dinner. I said we should keep it intimate. She agreed too quickly. My daughters discussed outfits, seating, who would arrive together. I nodded, occasionally offering neutral suggestions that kept me informed without committing me emotionally. I noticed how often they used the word fun, how casually they referenced how different this birthday would be. No one noticed that I stopped asking questions that assumed I would be there past the event. That was the advantage of being underestimated. Absence is invisible until it isn't. I thought briefly about confronting them early, about dismantling the plan before it reached its stage. I dismissed the idea without emotion. Exposure without consequence is just noise. I wasn't interested in explanations or apologies shaped by panic. I wanted alignment between actions and outcomes. They had chosen a public moment to reduce me. I chose a private moment to remove myself. The difference mattered. It preserved my authority, both internally and externally. I wasn't reacting to them. I was proceeding without them. There was one evening, about a week before the birthday, when my wife casually mentioned that someone special would be attending. She watched my face carefully as she said it, searching for confusion or insecurity. I smiled and said that sounded nice. The relief on her face was immediate. She mistook composure for ignorance. That misunderstanding sealed everything. In that moment, I saw how confident she was that I would play my role to the end, absorb the surprise gracefully, and exit quietly afterward. That assumption was the last thing she had left. I didn't correct it. As the date approached, calls from vendors began to increase, final confirmations, and small adjustments. I let them ring and returned them later, efficiently, politely, canceling what needed to be canceled and confirming what needed to continue under my control. Each conversation was brief. No explanations beyond logistical necessity. I imagined the confusion that would follow and felt nothing about it. Consequences don't require emotional investment to be effective. They require timing. I slept well during that period, not because I was numb, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by sequence. The night before her birthday arrived without ceremony. The house was quiet. My daughters were out. My wife was distracted enough not to notice how carefully I moved through shared spaces as if they were already transitional. I placed a folder on my desk and reviewed it once, ensuring everything was where it belonged. Evidence, decisions, boundaries, all aligned. There was no sense of victory, only readiness. I understood then that the joke had always had a date on it. They just assumed I would be the punchline. I turned off the light, knowing that assumption would expire by morning. By the time the morning of her birthday arrived, I was already finished with the part that required thought. What remained was execution, and execution, when done correctly, doesn't announce itself. I woke before anyone else, as I had for years, but that morning carried a different weight. Not heaviness, precision. I made coffee and drank it standing at the counter, not because I was restless, but because sitting felt unnecessary. I had already moved myself out of the emotional space of the house. I was operating from sequence now, not sentiment. Every step had been decided days earlier, and that gave the day an unusual calm. I checked my phone once, confirming timestamps and confirmations I had already seen. Vendors had acknowledged cancellations without comment. Deposits had been returned or forfeited depending on contract terms, none of which concerned me. The point was not recovery. The point was interruption. The structure that had been built around humiliating me depended on predictability, my funding, my silence, my presence. I had removed all three without signaling the change. That absence would land harder than any confrontation. People underestimate how destabilizing quiet disruption can be, especially when they assume control they don't actually have. My wife came downstairs shortly after, already dressed, already energized by the attention she expected later. She kissed my cheek absent-mindedly and thanked me again for handling everything. I nodded and wished her a happy birthday. The words sounded neutral because they were. Birthdays mark time, not loyalty. She didn't notice anything unusual in my tone because she wasn't listening for it. She had already moved on to the version of the day where I played my assigned role. I let her keep that illusion for a few more hours. There was no benefit in correcting it early. After she left to meet friends for lunch, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, not out of nostalgia, but inventory. Documents were already secured. Personal items I cared about were already removed or packed discreetly over the previous week. What remained were objects tied to shared narratives I no longer intended to maintain. I didn't rush. Rushing suggests doubt. I moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was leaving behind and why. When you stop hoping people will change, you also stop needing to prove anything to them. The legal preparations had been finalized the night before. Divorce papers printed, reviewed, and organized with the same attention I gave to business contracts. I had chosen not to involve anyone else in this step, not attorneys present, not witnesses. This wasn't about spectacle or leverage. It was about timing and containment. I placed the documents in a plain envelope and set it aside, out of sight, out of mind. It would be delivered privately. Public reckoning would come later, in its own way, without my narration. I spent the afternoon out of the house, not to avoid anyone, but to allow events to unfold without interference. I knew the first signs of collapse would begin with confusion, vendors calling, schedules unraveling, people realizing plans they thought were secure had quietly evaporated. I didn't need to witness that. Distance preserves perspective. When my phone buzzed with missed calls I didn't answer, I felt no urge to check who they were from. The pattern was predictable. Questions would escalate into panic, then into blame. None of that required my participation. In the late afternoon, I returned home briefly to collect the envelope and a small bag I had prepared. My wife wasn't there yet. The house felt strangely neutral, as if it had already accepted the shift before its occupants had. I placed the envelope on the dining table, positioned carefully, not dramatically. There was no note attached. The documents spoke clearly enough. I left again before she arrived, choosing to deliver the moment when it would be contained, not chaotic. Control isn't about dominance. It's about choosing the environment where truth is introduced. When I came back that evening, the atmosphere had changed. My wife was on the phone, pacing, her voice tight with forced politeness. She ended the call abruptly when she saw me and asked if I had heard from the catering company. I said I had, and that there must have been a misunderstanding. That was technically true. The misunderstanding was hers. I suggested she sit down and handed her the envelope. The shift in her expression was immediate, not explosive. Confusion, then recognition, then something close to fear. I stayed standing while she opened it. Power doesn't need volume. She didn't read everything at first. She scanned. Her face drained of color as she recognized screenshots she never thought would surface. She looked up at me once, searching for something. Anger, negotiation, permission to explain. I gave her nothing. Silence isn't passive when it's intentional. I told her I would be staying elsewhere that night, and that communication going forward would be handled through counsel. The words were simple. They didn't invite response. She tried to speak. I didn't stop her. I also didn't engage. There's a difference. I left before the conversation could turn into theater. Outside, the evening air was cool and unremarkable. I sat in my car for a moment, not to process, but to confirm something internally. I felt steady, not relieved, not vindicated, just steady. That told me everything I needed to know. Preparation without noise had done its work. The structure that had been built to embarrass me was collapsing under its own assumptions, and I wasn't inside it when it fell. As I drove away, I understood that the next phase wouldn't be quiet, but this one had needed to be, and it was complete. I didn't stay away long. Avoidance would have suggested hesitation, and I wasn't hesitant. I returned to the house later that night because there were still things that needed to be said, not argued. The driveway was crowded with unfamiliar cars, friends arriving early, people who hadn't yet realized the structure they expected to walk into no longer existed. I parked down the street and walked the rest of the way, not to delay, but to enter without announcement. Inside, voices overlapped with forced cheer. The party was trying to begin without its spine. I stood just beyond the doorway and understood immediately that the damage had already started to ripple outward. My wife was moving through the room too quickly, smiling without pausing long enough for anyone to ask questions. Her phone stayed in her hand. Every few minutes, she glanced at it, her expression tightening as unanswered calls accumulated. Vendors hadn't arrived. Tables were missing. Someone asked about the cake. Another asked about the music. She answered vaguely, promising it would all be sorted. When she finally saw me, the relief on her face was brief and misplaced. She thought my presence meant rescue, that I would quietly fix what had gone wrong the way I always had. That assumption lingered only seconds before reality corrected it. I asked her to step into the study with me. Not urgently. Not privately enough to draw attention, but firmly enough that refusal would have been noticeable. She followed, still holding onto the belief that this was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. Inside, I closed the door behind us and gestured to the chair across from my desk. She didn't sit. I placed the same envelope on the desk between us, the one she had already opened, already skimmed, but not fully absorbed. I told her this was her birthday gift, given early so there would be no confusion later. She finally sat then. The room was quiet in a way that made everything sharper. I didn't repeat accusations. I didn't list grievances. I told her simply that I knew everything, that the evidence was complete, and that I would not be attending the dinner or any event associated with it. I explained that the payments had been canceled intentionally and that no replacements would be arranged. Her mouth opened as if to argue, then closed again when she realized there was nothing procedural left to contest. This wasn't emotional. It was administrative. And administration doesn't bend under pleading. She tried explanation next. Not denial. She'd moved past that. But context, framing, excuses shaped like responsibility without accountability. She said she'd been unhappy for years. She said she felt unseen. She said the group had started as a joke and gotten out of hand. I listened without interruption, not because I was open to persuasion, but because I wanted to see how far she would go without prompting. She never mentioned the planning, never mentioned the bets, never mentioned the deliberate choice to humiliate me publicly. Silence reveals priorities. Hers were intact. When she finished, I told her my decision was final. Divorce proceedings would move forward without discussion. Assets would be divided according to the law, not sentiment. I would not explain myself to friends or family on her behalf. Whatever story she chose to tell would exist without my participation. That was the boundary. She asked if there was any way to fix this. I said no. Not harshly. Not kindly. Just clearly. Fixing implies restoration. I wasn't interested in restoring something that had required deception to function. The door opened before she could respond. One of my daughters stepped in, her expression tense, already aware that something had gone wrong. She looked between us and asked what was happening. I told her to sit. She didn't. She said people were asking questions. I said they would continue to do so. That was when the second daughter appeared, followed by raised voices from the hallway. The containment had ended. I hadn't planned for this moment to be public, but I didn't retreat from it either. Authority doesn't disappear just because an audience gathers unexpectedly. They spoke over each other at first, confusion, frustration, embarrassment spilling into accusation. When I raised my hand, they stopped. That surprised them. I told them I had seen the messages. All of them. I told them I knew how long it had been going on and what had been planned for tonight. One of them immediately blamed their mother. The other said she hadn't meant it seriously. Neither denied participation. That mattered. I told them I was done funding disrespect and that effective immediately, they would need to make other living arrangements. Their access to me, financial, emotional, logistical, ended that night. The shift was immediate and physical. Pleading replaced indignation. They cried, spoke quickly, promised change, invoked family, invoked history. I didn't interrupt. When they finished, I told them my decision was final. I said disowning them wasn't punishment. It was consequence. Trust, once coordinated against you, doesn't regenerate on demand. I walked them to the door myself, not angrily, but definitively. Outside, the party noise faltered as people sensed something irreversible had occurred. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I closed the door. Alone in the study again, I sat for the first time that day. The house was quieter than it had been in years, stripped of performance and pretense. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The gift had been given early, not to hurt, but to end something that had been quietly rotting. I knew the backlash would come next. Calls, pressure, rewritten narratives. But sitting there, I understood something important. I had not ruined a celebration. I had removed myself from a spectacle designed to erase me. And that distinction would matter more with time. The morning after the birthday arrived without ceremony, the way mornings do after something irreversible. I woke before sunrise in a quiet apartment I had secured weeks earlier, not because I anticipated leaving, but because contingency has always been a habit of mine. The phone on the nightstand was already lit with missed calls and messages stacked on top of each other, names repeating until they blurred into a single insistence. I didn't open any of them. Urgency from people who ignored you when you mattered isn't urgency. It's discomfort reacting to consequence. I made coffee and drank it slowly, watching the city wake up as if nothing personal had occurred. That normalcy grounded me more than any reassurance could have. By mid-morning, the calls shifted from my immediate family to extended relatives. Uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. Cousins who suddenly remembered my number. Their messages followed a pattern that was almost instructional in its predictability. They asked what happened, then told me I must be mistaken, then reminded me of how long I had been married, how hard divorce was on children, how forgiveness was a virtue. None of them asked whether I was all right. None of them asked what had been done to earn such finality. They were responding to disruption, not injustice. I let every call go unanswered. Silence, in that context, wasn't avoidance. It was accuracy. The first message I did listen to came from my eldest daughter late that afternoon. Her voice was shaky, rushed, layered with rehearsed remorse. She said she hadn't known about the extent of it. She said her mother had encouraged the tone, that it had started as venting and escalated. She said she felt sick knowing how it must have looked. I listened all the way through without stopping the playback. When it ended, I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. Even now, the apology was structured to preserve her access to me, not to confront what she had chosen to participate in. Responsibility was still being redistributed instead of owned. The next message came from my younger daughter. Hers was longer, more emotional, filled with references to childhood memories, to times when I had been supportive, present, generous. She cried openly, saying she didn't understand how I could cut them off like this, how I could be so calm about it. That question told me everything. They equated calm with cruelty because chaos had always been the currency of accountability in that house. I didn't respond. I archived the messages and turned the phone face down. I wasn't punishing them by not answering. I was protecting the boundary I had finally drawn. By the end of the week, the narrative had begun to shift. I heard about it secondhand from a former colleague who still spoke to my wife's circle. The story was no longer about what had been planned for the birthday. It was about my overreaction, my coldness, my midlife crisis. The existence of the messages was minimized, reframed as dark humor taken out of context. The boyfriend was suddenly described as a misunderstanding, a friend, someone I had supposedly known about. This was the stage where reality is edited to make discomfort survivable. I expected it. Preparation had included emotional distancing from exactly this. There was one meeting I did attend that week, and it wasn't family-related. It was with my attorney, who confirmed what I already knew. My actions were legally sound, my documentation thorough, my exposure minimal. He asked how I wanted to proceed with communication. I told him I didn't. Not yet. The absence of response was forcing everyone involved to sit with uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of clarifying priorities. People reveal what they value by what they try to regain first. In my family's case, it wasn't trust. It was access. The attempt to re-enter my life escalated when relatives began showing up unannounced at my former house, then at my office. Security handled it professionally, which was a quiet validation I hadn't anticipated needing. I was no longer the person who had to explain himself to maintain peace. Others managed that now. I received a final message from my wife near the end of the week, stripped of apology and full of accusation. She said I was destroying the family, that I would regret this, that I was choosing pride over love. I read it once and deleted it. Pride had nothing to do with it. Boundaries often look like pride to people who benefited from your absence of them. What surprised me most during that period wasn't the backlash. It was the speed with which I adjusted to its absence. Evenings were quieter. Decisions were simpler. I wasn't managing anyone else's emotions or expectations. I realized how much of my energy had been spent absorbing tension I didn't create. Removing myself from that system didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. The cost was real, but it was finite. The alternative had been ongoing erosion disguised as family unity. Near the end of the week, a distant cousin sent me a message that stood out from the rest. He said he had seen some of the screenshots circulating privately and that he believed me. He didn't ask me to reconcile. He didn't suggest compromise. He simply said he was sorry it had happened and that he respected how I handled it. That was the first validation I accepted, not because I needed it, but because it confirmed something important. The truth didn't require my defense to exist. It was already doing its work, quietly, unevenly, but persistently. I didn't respond to him either. Not because he was wrong, but because I was done engaging in narrative management. Expulsion had been final not just for my family, but for the role I had played within it. I was no longer the stabilizer, the forgiver, the one expected to absorb harm to preserve appearances. That version of me had been retired without ceremony. And as the noise of begging and blame continued to echo without reaching me, I understood that the next phase wouldn't be about defense or explanation. It would be about visibility, whether they were ready for it or not. The morning the headline broke, I was already awake, dressed, and seated at the small table by the window of my apartment. The city below moved with its usual indifference, commuters unaware that anything had shifted beyond their own schedules. I had known the announcement would run that day. The embargo had been negotiated carefully, timed not for celebration but for separation. When the notification finally appeared on my phone, I didn't rush to open it. I finished my coffee first. Ritual matters when you're closing one chapter and opening another. It reminds you that life continues even when narratives collapse. The article was clean, factual, restrained. My name, my new title, the company, one of the largest furniture manufacturers in New York, framed as a strategic choice, not a gamble. There was no mention of my previous job loss, no hint of the private chaos that had preceded this moment. To the public, this was a straightforward success story, a professional ascent earned quietly over time. That omission was intentional. I had insisted on it. I didn't want redemption framed as comeback. I wanted it framed as continuity. I had never stopped moving forward. I had simply done it without an audience. The call started within minutes. Numbers I recognized. Numbers I didn't. 90 in total by the end of the day, according to the log I never cleared. Voicemails stacked one after another, voices overlapping in tone if not in words. Shock was the common thread. Disbelief. Then urgency. My wife left 3 messages, each more frantic than the last, her narrative shifting in real time as she recalibrated what this meant. The daughters followed, their apologies sharpened now by public consequence. Relatives chimed in, suddenly eager to reconnect, to clarify misunderstandings, to reframe the past as something salvageable. I didn't answer any of them. What struck me wasn't their reaction to my success. It was their reaction to being wrong. The group had built an entire mythology around my decline, my supposed irrelevance, my dependency, my inevitable unraveling. That story had justified their behavior. It had made cruelty feel preventative, even reasonable. The headline dismantled that justification in a single line of print. Without my participation, without my rebuttal, the truth arrived anyway. Not loudly. Not vindicatively. Just undeniably. That was the consequence they hadn't planned for. I spent that day doing what I would be doing for the foreseeable future, meeting with my executive team, reviewing operational briefings, aligning on priorities. No one mentioned my personal life. No one asked how it felt to win. In that room, competence was assumed, not negotiated. Authority wasn't something I had to assert. It was structural. I realized then how stark the contrast was between the systems I had outgrown and the one I had entered. One thrived on ambiguity and emotional leverage. The other functioned on clarity and accountability. I knew which one I intended to invest in going forward. In the afternoon, I received a message from the unknown man, the boyfriend whose name had first appeared in that group. His tone was cautious, almost respectful. He said he hadn't known about the extent of the planning, that he felt misled, that he wanted to clear the air. I read it once and deleted it. His involvement had never been the point. He was a variable in a system that rewarded disrespect. Removing the system made the variable irrelevant. I wasn't interested in sorting villains from bystanders. I was interested in permanence. Late that evening, as the city lights came on, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Not on what I had gained, but on what had been revealed. The twist wasn't my promotion. That had been in motion long before the group was created. The twist was realizing that my wife had known about it too. Buried deep in the messages, something I hadn't fully processed at the time, was a reference to his fantasy job and how it would never materialize. She hadn't just mocked my loss. She had dismissed my future because she assumed I needed her belief to achieve it. That assumption had shaped everything. She hadn't been planning to humiliate a man she thought was weak. She had been planning to erase a man she thought was dependent. That distinction mattered. It reframed the past 2 years not as abandonment during failure, but as an attempt to control the narrative of my worth. The group wasn't just cruelty. It was preemptive. They needed me diminished so their choices would feel justified. Seeing that made the ending feel inevitable rather than dramatic. Once you understand the motive, the outcome stops feeling harsh. I didn't feel tempted to respond then. Silence had become fluent, not forced. The calls eventually slowed, then stopped. Stories would continue without me, revised and softened over time to make them livable for those who told them. That was fine. I wasn't responsible for maintaining their comfort anymore. I had reset the terms by exiting completely, not with anger, but with finality. That was the generational shift. My daughters would grow up understanding, eventually, that access is not unconditional and that loyalty is not inherited by default. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized something else that felt quietly decisive. I hadn't taken revenge. I hadn't exposed them publicly or corrected every lie. I had simply stepped out of a system that required my degradation to function and into one that didn't know how to use me unless I was whole. The win wasn't the headline. It was the absence of their voices in my head when I turned off the light. That silence wasn't empty. It was earned, and it was permanent. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, quietly erased, or forced to choose self-respect over comfort, take a moment to like this video so it reaches others who need to hear it. Share it with someone who understands the cost of silence and the power of walking away with dignity. And subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life stories where strength isn't loud, revenge isn't cruel, and the real victory is choosing yourself. See you soon in the next story.